Welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we are joined by Mrs. Amber Kanwar, host of the In the Money podcast, a video podcast where Amber sits down with top portfolio managers to deliver insights and advice on investing to everyday investors. New episodes are out every Tuesday and Thursday and are available on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Prior to launching the In the Money podcast, Mrs. Kanwar spent approximately 15 years at BNN Bloomberg, where she interviewed hundreds of portfolio managers, CEOs, political leaders, and newsmakers. Mrs. Kanwar also earned a Master's of Journalism degree at Ryerson University and a Bachelor of Management and Organizational Studies at Western University. Among other things, we discussed building a new media company, the art of conversation, and a few experiences and lessons from working at BNN for 15 years. This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. This podcast episode is brought to you by EPAC, the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada. Good afternoon, Mrs. Amber Kanwar. Thank you very much for doing this.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Trevor.
For the listener, you are a former anchor at BNN Bloomberg and CTV, but nowadays you have your own podcast called In the Money Pod, if I'm correct?
Yeah, that's right. In the Money with Amber Kanwar. And then our website is inthemoneypod.com.
For the purposes of the conversation today, I thought we could structure it around your origins in media and how you got into the career and your experiences at BNN, and then get into your new podcast and why you started it, if that works for you.
Perfect.
So to go back to the beginning, how did you get into media and why?
Well, I would say that I've always thought I should, I sought out the limelight as a young child. My parents took me to California in grade 7, and that was like, I was just so enamored. And I thought, oh, yes, this is the life that I want. I just had no talent. I can't act, I can't sing, and I can't dance. And so that really wasn't for me. Also, my parents, they're Indian parents. They're not super thrilled with the idea of me going off and pursuing an acting career. So I had to finish my education. I got a business degree. And after I got the business degree, I said, well, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do anything related to business. But I had a sociology major, and I really enjoyed that, like diving into social justice issues. So I thought, why don't I do journalism? And so immediately after Western, my business degree, I did a master's of journalism at what is now Toronto Metropolitan University, but the former Ryerson University. And after that, I set out and I said, well, great. Now I can do my deeply important journalistic work. And then I couldn't find a job. And so what I ended up doing is just cold emailing BNN and saying, hey, like I have a business degree, I have a journalism degree. Seems like I should work here, right? A business news channel. And I didn't hear anything for 3 weeks. And then finally someone emailed me back and said, we have a broadcast associate position. Could you do that? And I was like, of course. And I had no idea what a broadcast associate is or does, but I said yes anyway. And turns out it's really coffee and putting mics on guests. It was as entry level as it gets. And I'm so grateful I started that way because I got a ground floor of how that newsroom works. And there was pretty much, as I moved up in the organization over the course of several years, it was nice knowing the lay of the land, and there was nothing, if something went wrong, like I knew how to get to the root of a solution just because I knew everything about how the organization worked.
Originally from Toronto?
Yeah, kind of. My parents we grew up like outside of Toronto in the country. And then I moved to the city, like maybe 16 years ago.
And like you mentioned, did your business degree at Western and then a journalism degree at, I think it's Ryerson?
Ryerson, yeah.
But you eventually ended up at BNN and rose to become the lead anchor.
I guess so. Yeah, that makes it seem like that happened very quickly. But it did take time. So I started at BNN as an intern, basically, as I said, filling up those mugs, filling up the coffee and putting mics on guests. And then I kind of figured out like, hey, maybe one day I would like to be on air. The problem is I had no TV experience and I had no finance experience. You know, my business degree was like HR. It was not, I didn't know anything about finance. And so what ensued for like the next 2 years was almost like a crash MBA simply through BNN, watching the channel, listening to the guests, learning from the best anchors, and really, really trying very hard, trying and failing a lot of the time. And I cared a lot. Once I figured out what I wanted, it really drove me. And I would say, I faked it a lot. For example, I knew I wanted to be on air, but I was like 23, 22. And so who's going to give somebody like me a shot in an environment where they're used to hearing from these like authoritative, often older, often male voices about a very serious subject that is hard to kind of fake your way through. But, just small things. Well, big things. I went and I showed that I'm dedicated. I took a securities course. I worked hard. I put my hand up for every little assignment, and communicated like, yes, I'd like to advance. But the little things like I dressed like I wanted to be on TV. I didn't dress like a 22, 23-year-old. I wore sort of business clothes and I wanted it to look like, hey, if you were to like just pan the camera over here, this is somebody who could be possibly presentable. And so that was very much in my mind, even at a young age.
What led you to the conclusion that you wanted to become an anchor on BNN? When did you start to realize that was what you wanted to do?
I feel like it was pretty early on, but I knew that there was a big gap. And the gap was I didn't know anything. And so I was like, how do I fill this in with information? How do I learn about the markets? How do I communicate about the markets? Because it's one thing to learn about them. Then you have to find a way to talk about it in a way that makes sense. And I could shroud myself in jargon, the way that the industry speaks, and not fuss myself with like knowing what that jargon meant. But I did homework every day to understand, like, how do I find out what's happening? So learning the Bloomberg terminal, subscribing to everyone's research. I get all the big banks' research. How do I get on equity distribution lists? How do I read all these analyst notes? Who are people that I can call that I feel safe with when I'm like, hey, what's a bond? Like that I can ask my stupid questions to. So it was really just assembling all of those different elements. And then being comfortable on air, that took a lot of time. So I was put on air at 25. Mm-hmm. And looking back, look, that's insane. I was too young. I didn't know anything. I knew some stuff, but like not what I know now. And so that I think came through. If you watch me at 25, I look like someone who is terrified to be there. And then former anchor Kim Parley told me when people speak, they have an underlining question. And my underlining question is, am I good enough? There was an insecurity that came through in the way that I spoke. And her recommendation at the time was to do an improv class at Second City. And that was like, I recommend everybody do that, even if you're not in, the public eye or you don't do a lot of public speaking, because it was almost like therapy. Uh-huh. They really just teach you to be in the moment. People come places with a lot in their head about what am I going to say here and what's going to happen if this happens. And improv is just let it all go and react to whatever happens in front of you. And part of my success, I think, on air is I am comfortable with knowing I'm going to mess up. And I never actually watched myself back, but I always watched myself mess up. I would go back to it because in that moment, it feels like eternity. Your heart is racing. Your skin is flushed. You are like, everyone thinks I'm so stupid. But when you watch it back, it's usually less than 5 seconds. Like it doesn't live on as long as you thought it lived on. So it's just like, those little things and stitching it together.
As a female rising up to the ranks, a largely male environment, did you have a strategy that you pursued from that angle, or did you think about it differently, or were you just making your way as you went?
I would say that as a woman in financial journalism, I had an edge at the beginning of my career. As I said, I didn't want to do business journalism. I wanted to be an entertainment reporter, be a social justice reporter. There's a lot of people who look like me and who are smarter than me who do those jobs. So the field is very crowded. There aren't a lot of people who look like me that put their hand up for this kind of job. So I was able to take advantage of that opportunity. There are very few people at 25 with the lack of experience that I have that would have been made an anchor at a national news channel. And yes, BNN is smaller than CTV or CBC, but it's still national. And so I think that that was part of the value proposition. So fine. Did that help me in the beginning? For sure. But if I was an idiot, if I didn't have like the substance underneath, I wouldn't have been able to sustain, that 15-year career. So I would say initially, maybe it helped me stand out. It helped me be a little bit of a diversifier. Later in my career, I realized that, maybe I was starting to hit some limits. Some of those are practical limits. I have 3 children. And so I've had 3 maternity leaves. And while the company is great about supporting you and giving that time, this is true not just for me, but for most women, I think, or in the conversations I have with them. So when you leave for a year and then you come back, the organization still got on without you. And so when you come back, you got all kinds of obligations at home. I couldn't work at the maybe max intensity that I was doing in my 20s, but I'd earned a reputation. I was still competent, but I felt that I had to work extra hard to stay in place. Like I was gone for a year and now I have to kind of remind people like, hey, I'm here. This is what I can do. This is what I'm capable of. And I kind of it felt like I had to fight to just get back to the level and stature that I was before. So I was really, grateful that in my 20s, before I had kids, I worked, I put my hand up for everything. Part of when I first went on air, I was on air at 7 a.m., which meant I was in the office at 4 a.m., which meant I was waking up at 3 a.m. every day. In my 20s, that's sort of like social kryptonite, right? Because I was going to bed at 7. I couldn't really mail it in the next day. I was going to be on camera. Like my dating out the window, my friends, like I just had that's a very difficult schedule to keep for anybody. And it's very difficult when you're young, but it was a sacrifice that I made. And I'm glad that I did because I wouldn't have been able to do it sort of as a mom. So I feel like I ran into headwinds and, motherhood and the statistics bear that out. For most women, the wage gap does not show up until they have children because we have this whole other obligation that we have to deal with. And yes, there's still like people call me like sweetheart or little lady, when they're coming up on set. And I hope that, after that interview, maybe I'm not such a sweetheart or little lady after that. That's been more on the margins. So yeah, I think it's wrong to deny that gender plays a role either on the upside or the downside because it does for men, just differently for women. And I've had my fair share of experiences with that.
How did you balance the nice Amber and the kind of affable characteristics of the role with asking tough questions that, although people want to listen to, may irritate the person you're talking to? Did you get better at that through the years?
Yeah, I think so. Initially, when I would do interviews, I was thinking, okay, I want people to think I'm smart. And so I really invested a lot in my questions. So much so that if somebody was talking and answering my questions, all I was thinking about is, what's my next question? And what's it going to be? And I wasn't really responding, again, because I was afraid. I didn't want to make mistakes. After a couple of years of doing the job and watching people who are, my mentors there, like Paul Bagnall, Howard Green, Francis Rudelsky, you pick up some skills. One skill from Paul that I'll never forget is, ask a short, sharp question. I can sound like a genius in a long question, but the viewer's not there for that. Just ask a short, sharp question. And that kind of slightly not throws them off, but then they're like, oh, I got to answer this question. It was a direct question. I didn't give them an out. Mm-hmm. I said, what about this? And I don't give them the answer sort of in the question. You know what I mean? The other is just to listen to the guest. And that requires you to have two thoughts at the same time. I'm listening. I'm prepared to follow up, but I know where I'm going to take the interview, and I'm not going to let my follow up distract from where we're going. My northern light was always the viewer. I'm not working for the person I'm interviewing. And yes, I need them, right? I need them to put their hand up and be part of the interview. But if I cater too much to that person, I'm going to alienate our main constituent, which is the viewer. So the worst thing to me was imagining a viewer watching from home or watching from work and saying, why isn't she asking this question? It's the most obvious question. Why didn't she follow up on that? So I always just try to put myself in the viewer position. What's going to serve the viewer? How am I going to help them make money by watching this interview? And how are they going to be best served by the answers coming from the guests?
Did you find there was an art to the conversation? For instance, making your guests feel comfortable and then balancing in some tough questions, maybe some humor. Did you think of it kind of as an organic art form? Or was it?
Yeah, that came through trial and error. For example, I once did an interview with Chip Wilson, who's the founder of Lululemon. And this was back, I'm kind of early-ish in my career. But if you'll remember, there was a whole kind of fiasco that he created by saying, so Lululemon's pants were poorly made at the time. And when women would bend over, they would go sheer and you would be able to see through them. And Chip Wilson made a gaffe in an interview in Bloomberg saying, well, maybe some women just shouldn't wear those pants, basically suggesting that the body type is only a certain body type should be in Lululemon. Anyway, that had already happened. That was a big gap. Several months later, Chip Wilson, he wasn't CEO, but he still had shares. And so he had almost turned activist on Lululemon. And he was criticizing the company and saying all the things that they do poorly. And that was one where I had a list of questions, but he was really criticizing the current management for, the situation Lulu was in. And I just said, well, don't you think you're partly to blame for that? And he kind of stopped and he was like, well, what do you mean by that? And I was like, and that was a hot face moment where I'm like, oh, like, remember that whole like sheer pants thing? But then he kind of shut down and the interview like went south from there, except it was supposed to be, I think, like a 7-minute interview. And that was my second question. So it's tough to like torpedo an interview and then you still have like 5 minutes of airtime to fill. So that was sort of, I guess, if I'm going to do a hard-hitting interview, I maybe don't ask that question first. I do ask with like let's make you comfortable. Let's talk about this. And maybe question 3 or 4 so that I still have enough time, right? I don't want it to be at the very end, like, oh, by the way, and ask the most important question at the end. So I definitely did think about that. Now, having said that, sometimes it is the story and you're coming on, your stock's down 20%. I'm not going to say like, let's talk about what was great in the quarter. We're going to talk about your stock's down 20%. What are you saying to investors? But you said this and that's not what happened in the quarter. Again, you have to serve the viewer. So it's an art. You just have to figure out, what am I going to lead with? What's going to best serve the viewer? And how am I going to have the best conversation for them? And I guess I always tried to, if I was, people said say that I ask the tough questions, but in a way that's not like, it's not got you. It's almost like, I have a smile maybe, but like, isn't it true that you did promise to do this last quarter? And isn't it true that that didn't happen this quarter? And ultimately give a platform for these people to explain themselves.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info@conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This podcast episode is brought to you by JSG Professional Services, Canada's trusted leader in pipeline construction management and inspection resources. JSG provides competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources, supporting Canada's largest pipeline companies from initial development through final execution. Whether your project involves new pipeline construction, integrity programs, maintenance, pump stations, compressor stations, or inline inspections, JSG has consistently delivered experienced professionals to Canada's energy industry. JSG proudly supports Canada's energy infrastructure with competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources. Visit jsginc.com for more information. For the record, I am a big Chip Wilson fan, so maybe one day, if I'm lucky, I'll be able to talk to him about some issues, and big fan. But there are different levels of sophistication within any field. Did you find it was more valuable to stick high level with your questions, or the real, I guess, esoteric topics of any field? Did you feel a different approach was better?
It's tough. As I said, when you put your feet in the shoes of the viewer, then you can have some focus. Sometimes it's important to get esoteric, but am I just doing it to prove like how much I know about the topic, or is it actually germane to the conversation that we're having? My guiding light is always, how can I help somebody make money? How can this be useful for them? And I only had 7 minutes, right? And we'll talk about why I think this platform is so great. Like podcasting is so great because you can ask those follow-up questions. But let's say I only have 7 to 8 minutes. It's just interviewing in that amount of time is just a series of little trade-offs. Fine, I might not get into something like super interesting here because I'm going to favor something more useful, right? And so you're just that's the sense. You just have to sense, okay, where is this going? How am I going to make this the most useful for our viewers? And sometimes that means you got to go into the weeds. I have to know about what's going on in this like small project because it happens to be tanking your stock. So if you're telling me there's an operational issue or whatever, like let's get into it. Help me understand it. But if that's not really the story, maybe I'll pivot and maybe it will be high level because, for example, our country seems to be under attack from our closest ally. And maybe a C-suite perspective is more important right now on that topic versus like what's going on operationally at like a mine that's only 5% of their portfolio.
When did you stop getting nervous interviewing high-profile people?
I could say that happened over several waves. Obviously, just practice makes perfect. Screwing up enough, you get kind of immune to it. Also, now I have a firm grasp on the material. I'm not as afraid, of finance. There's nothing that you can say that would really be like, ooh, I'm out of my depth here. But if I am out of my depth, I feel like, well, I've been doing this long enough. So if I'm out of my depth, probably a casual observer is out of their depth. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Like it's less scary for me because I just have to ask questions. I don't really have to come up with answers except when I'm on Trevor Rose podcast. I don't have to really come up with answers. Improv classes really helped me a lot. But also seeing other quote unquote more important people be nervous just really shows you that we're all just humans, right? Like I've shared the stage with like my idols, either in financial journalism or in the finance world. Well, I don't have idols in the finance world, but big deals in the finance world. And I've seen them be nervous backstage. I've seen them pace back and forth. And that's oddly calming to me because I'm like, if this person is nervous and they've accomplished so much, like we're all just kind of faking it. So just do a good job of faking it and no one will be the wiser.
The traditional media world has been changing the last handful of years with the decline of cable TV and the old forms of media. Did you notice that the last few years while you were at BNN?
I don't know that I felt that the viewer was ever going anywhere. I think demand for content has never been higher. And at the same time, content providers are struggling. So how can that mismatch exist? And I think it's just, I use like the Amazon and brick and mortar stores. Amazon, people were still shopping, right? It wasn't like people stopped shopping, just their habits are changing. And are you adapting to those changing habits or not? And legacy brick and mortar had a tough time because they had all these legacy issues to deal with. They had physical footprints. They were just not set up to deal with how patterns were changing. And I think a similar thing is happening in media. The demand for content is high, but the patterns are changing. And so the winners are going to be people who adapt the quickest to those patterns and, shed those, I guess, sacred cows or whatever they are around, how they currently operate.
The rise of independent media like podcasts has shifted attention. It sounds like you didn't notice it too much at BNN.
I would say that BNN has a very strong brand and has a very loyal group of people who watch it. Of course, we noticed, and everybody in media has noticed, there are fewer resources to go around. So where previously we would have easily sent a reporter, a province away or to cover a story, the questions about the ROI on that are certainly growing. But as you say, like with the rise of independent media, I think that demonstrates that like the appetite is still very much there. And it's just like all these companies are just dealing with other issues that are not necessarily problems with the consumer, right? Like they're still there. They still want the information. The stock market still exists. They still want ways to make money. Like all those core foundations are still there. There's just issues because they're just set up differently. I don't care where I get my views. I don't care if it's on YouTube. I don't care if it's on Apple. I don't care if it's on Spotify. I have that luxury because I can just go on all the platforms. But if you've established a brand and you need to get views only on TV, you need to get views only on your website, that's an obstacle for you.
You left BNN after about 15 years?
Yeah.
What led to the decision to leave? Was it just time for a change?
I think it was time for a change. I did see the change in the industry happening as well. Like a couple of years ago, I never would have done this. I would have thought, to be honest, I would have thought what a huge step down. So much of who I was in my professional career was I'm Amber Kanwar from BNN Bloomberg. And I really thought the BNN Bloomberg is what made me. And I never thought that, to be honest, that I could stand on my own. I didn't think I had the kind of following or anything, that I was really nothing without BNN Bloomberg. And I also loved the job. Like I really loved it. I could have kept on doing it. But again, I'd been doing it for a long time. I see these new forms popping up. I have an entrepreneurial streak in me. And when I see something that should be done and is not being done, I really can't live. Like it's just this tension inside of me. And like, I just can't do something that is inefficient. So I see this growth that is happening. I don't feel like I'm adequately participating in it or have control in my ability to participate in it. So then I just kind of take matters into my own hands. And I just feel like I got lucky because I'm catching it at a time where the growth is exploding.
Well, we'll get into your podcast in a few questions, but your time at BNN, you met a lot of interesting people and high-profile leaders. Did anyone stick out that you either A, really enjoyed talking to, or B, was very insightful through the years?
My favorite conversations are always just the most candid. So I don't really care if you're a portfolio manager or a CEO. Like sometimes I've interviewed, like a huge bank CEO. That's not my favorite interview. Because he didn't say anything, right? He was so on message. My high is like getting unique insights. My high is getting something out of somebody that they didn't say anywhere else or that's new and informative. That I struggled with that. High level politicians. I mean, I don't think I have the skill to do a political interview because my God, like they're just, I ask about a policy and they tell me the sky is blue. It's just like not. So those interviews I find very frustrating. My favorites are just with people who are just candid and say what they think and have an opinion. A lot of Canadian executives are afraid to have an opinion. So I often found the most fruitful executive interviews are with American CEOs where it's commonplace to maybe have political opinions. Now, this could be changing considering what's going on in politics in this country. And I feel like we're getting more vocal on both like the domestic politics situation and with the U.S. political situation. So some favorites that I had, like, BlackBerry was kind of always my story. So interviewing John Chen, who was a CEO in the US, like he was always just very candid. Didn't work out well for shareholders under his tenure, but I felt like he was always like pretty upfront. In Alberta, I always felt like Mike Rose, Jeff Tonkin, they were just candid. Jeff especially, I think one time he brought, this might have been around carbon tax time. He like brought his gas bill from his house to like make the point about, what it's doing for everyday people. And so that was obviously outside of what he was talking about with Birchcliff. But those are people that kind of stand out. And I remember, I've done a few central bank interviews with Stephen Poloz and those are interesting as well. They can be, it could be boring, but like central bankers to me was like, that's like my Beyonce level. When I was, just starting out, I was like, oh my God, if I can interview a central banker, like that's, I'll know I've made it. Just getting insights on what was it like during the financial crisis? You were there, you were in the eye, like what was it like to like pick up the phone and have Ben Bernanke call you and say, Lehman's falling tomorrow, right? Like that's history. And so that's really cool because you get those fly on the wall moments. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, so it's hard to just pick one, but my favorites are always the people that were just themselves.
Did you have a approach to get people to relax and be themselves? Or was it just luck of the draw?
I feel like it was luck of the draw. I'd like to say that I was skilled and I relaxed people. But yeah, I kind of just took them as they were. I could tell if they were nervous. And so I would always say to them, you know everything. I'm not going to ask you something you don't know about. So just remember that you know everything. And if you stumble or whatever, just keep going because it's never as bad as you think.
On the flip side to your favorite people, when you inevitably came across someone you didn't like, how did you separate the emotion from the facts of the conversation? Did you find that difficult?
I don't think in the middle of an interview, I decided I don't like this person. I think I decided, okay, this person's not going to give me anything. And I just end the interview. If I can't keep going, I won't. And that would be a nightmare for my producers. That did not happen very often. But if you're not going to be like open and honest or, offer me genuine insights or just be too kind of robotic or whatever, I hate those interviews. So I think I would just end it, but some people were quasi rude, I guess. And I don't know, I just don't interview them again. I had that luxury. I had my own show and I could decide which guests came on the show or not. And ultimately, if you weren't a good guest, I had the ability to say, like, I don't want to speak to that person again.
Podcasts have been a good format because it allows you to get more into details and get full answers, which leads us to your podcast, In the Money with Amber Kanwar. Yeah. So I guess the question is, why did you start the podcast? What led to that decision?
I think I probably dreamed it up initially to stay relevant. After I left BNN, I thought, Well, I still had that, I need to be Amber Kanwar of something. And so I was like, why don't I do a podcast? But then it really became more than that. It was like, it really became this idea born out of 15 years of, I know what investors want. I know what the viewers want. They just want to make money. They want actionable insights. They want to know how they can best position their portfolio. And yes, we can have a macro talk, and yes, we can have a policy talk. But at the end of the day, the way that the viewer is best served by financial news is by helping give them an edge, give them insights, give them access to institutional quality advice so they can decide, A, do I want to invest with that portfolio manager? Or B, like, do I want to buy that stock for my TFSA? Can I make money on it? And so the idea, I think, is our core foundation at In the Money. You know, I get pitched guests like a chief economist or a macro conversation. Like, no, it just needs to be actionable. We need to be able to talk about the markets. They need to give their best ideas. It just has to be insightful because I really believe investing changes lives. And so if I can be part of that or help people, you know, pick the right stock, get a good stock, like that's all, that would be great. But just to also feel like they can do it. Finance, I think, has a reputation of being inaccessible. It clouds itself in jargon and complicated models. But I think everybody should feel like they have control over their investments because it can be so transformational for people. So I don't want them to rule it out for themselves. So I try to make the podcast as accessible as possible.
Yeah, criticism of national television and financial advice is that sometimes the guests on TV aren't really there for the guest benefit. They're there to gather assets to manage and their incentives aren't aligned. So how do you spot those red flags or people that maybe aren't doing it for the right reasons?
I mean, the only reason they're coming on is to sell their fund, right? Like, so I know that it's what motivates them. It's what brings them here. I'm motivated by something different, but we both motivated by different things have come together. So another thing I always say is you're going to say what you're going to say and I'm going to say what I'm going to say, right? If you want to go off and talk about and be overly promotional, you can. I don't think that's going to read very well. That's on you. And I probably won't have you back on as a guest. But if you just show your work, you show your process, you say, you know, I like this stock for this reason, and this is why I'm thinking about it. That's an audition in and of itself, right? I know why they're coming on my show. That's why they're going on BNN. That's why they're getting quoted in the Globe. Not doing it out of the kindness of their heart. It's advertising. And I get that. My job is to make sure that A, I'm stress testing those ideas, and B, it's still serving the audience. We're still giving them ideas. Yeah, we're both getting something out of it, but I feel like that's pretty out there.
Well, the best fund managers cap their funds. You don't want any more money. It's kind of a weight on their performance. Did you ever find yourself having to search for those kind of undercover asset managers that prefer to stay out of the limelight?
Yes, I'm still searching. It's hard to get some of them on. And that's just like good old fashioned journalism is you just keep calling and you pick up the phone and you say, I think you should do it. I think you should do it. You annoy them to death. They call it chasing for a reason.
Your podcast often takes a lot of questions from guests. Are there common themes or trends or types of questions that you've noticed, or even through the years of BNN that resurface again and again?
Well, people have stopped asking about BlackBerry, but for a long time, they did start, it was like, they want to know, is BlackBerry going to come back? And actually, it's so funny because BlackBerry right now is the best performing stock on the TSX in 2025. You know, it's well off of its highs, but that goes to show you, you know, things that people often ask about. Once they drop off, that's when a stock starts to outperform. I don't know if there's a common theme. What always surprises me is just how deep the knowledge is by our viewers. They ask about all kinds of things, complicated covered call strategies, you know, a mid-cap U.S. industrial stock. So that's why I love the viewer question part because, yeah, I can ask about Mag 7, I can ask about oil, I can ask about gold. But the viewer questions is where we can get the stuff that maybe it's not newsy, but our viewers are into it. It's a stock that they have. And it really helps to surface those like non-newsy type of stocks because you can still make plenty of money there.
This podcast episode is powered by Broadbill Energy, the local midstream company that puts producers first. Broadbill Energy does things differently and doesn't just move energy. They are moving the industry forward. While others take a cut, Broadbill shares profits back with their customers because when Broadbill customers win, so does Broadbill. With a producer-focused approach, Broadbill specializes in the gathering, processing, and transportation of oil and gas, ensuring safety, reliability, and maximum value for the people who actually produce the energy. If you're tired of the same old midstream model and want a partner that works for you, it's time to talk to Broadbill. Visit broadbillenergy.com to learn more. This episode is brought to you by Astro Oilfield Rentals. Planning your next drilling or completion site or budgeting for an upcoming construction project? Astro has your remote communications and accommodations needs covered. With over 25 years of experience serving Western Canada, Astro continues to expand, innovate, and deliver the best value for your investment. Astro offers a full range of communication solutions, including cell towers, radios, and internet services. Astro's lineup features well site trailers, sleepers, full gym units, medic centers, and custom-built command centers, helping you stay connected and comfortable in even the most remote locations. Visit astrorentals.ca for virtual tours and more information. The financial world can be a bit dry at times. Have you had to balance your creativity with the straightforward aspects of the business world, and how do you approach that when coming up with questions?
I think the fact that it is dry is where the creativity comes into play because I have to look at a quarterly earnings results and say, what's the story here? I have to look at annual revenue and say, what is the story? And it's also all in the way you present the material. So you can say earnings missed, the guide was light. What does that mean? Profit at Coke was worse than expected, and they warned that it's going to be difficult for the rest of the year. You know, one is facts and one is a story, and it's a story that makes you want to know more. Why is it going to be difficult? Well, actually, it's related to the cost of aluminum going up, right? Because there's a trade war. I'm just making this up, but you see what I mean? It's up to you whether it's going to be interesting or not. I inherently think finance is interesting because it's about money and everybody loves money and talking about money and making money. So it's about you. It's really on you. Like, are you going to sell this? Are you going to make it work? Are you going to tell the right story? And first, you have to find it. You have to look at the quarterly statement and say, what is the story? You know, and I would say that to my producers all the time. Don't just tell me earnings beat. Don't just tell me this. Tell me the story. Don't just tell me sales grew 30%. Tell me sales grew 30% and it was the best quarter they've ever seen. Or sales grew 30%, but that was the slowest pace of growth for, you know, say it's NVIDIA or something like that. I mean, NVIDIA would die if it was only 30% growth. But you know what I mean? It's like, tell me a story, look at the numbers, find the story, and then tell it to people.
There's a lot of randomness and noise in the markets. On the other hand, do you ever have to balance coming up with narratives that maybe aren't conclusive with the fact that a lot of times it's just random? How do you explain that story? How do you
I don't think it is just random. It's all driven by price, right? And stocks move generally for specific reasons, definitely over the long term. And I think that you can find, yes, was it hard on days where like the TSX is at 0.1% and you have to do like your fifth market update of the day? Definitely. But even in those markets, you can find a story. Fine. Today's market move is not the big story. But for example, I would take a look at what's the biggest laggard list? What's the biggest winner list? What do they have in common? What does it tell us about what's going on in the markets? Like, let's use BlackBerry as an example. It's the best performing stock in 2025. Why is that? What is going on here? Aside from that, it's all gold stocks. Why is that? Tariffs. Does this have longevity? Is this sustainable? Should you be in small? How have small caps done relative to large caps? What's the story there So I don't ever buy that there's no story. You can always find it. You have to be so interested in the markets. You have to just love it. And I am always looking for trends and saying like, what's unique about what's happening in the markets right now? Even if the index is flat, what percent is above its 52-week moving average? Like, I tell you, I can pull these narratives out all day long.
As a fellow podcast host, I can relate to the podcast market as being competitive. So what do you think separates your podcasts from others, and what makes you different?
I think that I have a clear focus on investable ideas. So there's a million business podcasts out there. I think the one standout is I'm only going to give you actionable insights. So if you want to know what to do with your money, you've got some dollars you want to invest, you tune into my podcast, you'll get an idea. You might get several over the course of one episode. So that's my value proposition. And I don't plan on deviating from that very much. I might do like an odd CEO interview, but again, it will be geared towards like, how can we make this actionable, useful for investors? Not just investors. I actually just did a handbag episode where we talk about handbags as stocks. If you're going to spend 10 grand on a handbag, which one should you buy? So that was really cool because I like talking about that stuff, but how do I make it useful? So one, it's investable. Two, like I guess people are familiar with me in this country if you're interested in business. So I'm a known quantity. They know what they're getting. I think that technically now I fall in the finfluencer category, but I'm not a finfluencer. I'm not peddling a product, masquerading it as editorial. I have advertisers. That's just like what I got to do to keep the lights on. And I've been really grateful for their support because they came on board before I even had a podcast, right? Like before I published my first episode. So I think part of why they did that is they saw this too. They see that people want actionable insights and they want to get it through a podcast. So yeah, there's tons of commentary podcasts. There's tons of deep dive podcasts. And those are amazing. And so I didn't really want to compete with them. And I thought maybe this is missing. Just a short, 45 minutes to an hour on just investable ideas. That's still interesting. Like, let's still make it unique and insightful and get at these stories you might not get elsewhere. But let's do it with the lens of, we're just trying to help you make money.
Who inspires you nowadays?
Oh, like in the podcast world?
In general, career, podcast world?
Well, my OG inspiration is my mother. She's an entrepreneur and she is like, that woman doesn't understand the word no. She started a company when she was 26 in nuclear medicine and she's not a doctor. So that just like gives you a sense of like, and she just had children. And instead of like keeping her stable job at the hospital, she's like, why don't I try starting up these nuclear medicine clinics, something that hadn't been done on an independent level. And she was kind of a trailblazer in that way. So I always grew up with like a CEO as my mother. And that is a model for me on like how to be able to do both, though I'm not as good at it as she was. But also like, I never thought I had what it takes because she just like, as I said, the word no means nothing to her. And she hears people criticize her all the time or say this won't work and that won't work. But she just sees, no, this will work. And here's how we're going to push through and get there. And I didn't feel like I had that until I found something I had high conviction in. And it turns out I'm a lot like her. And I don't really hear no that well either, especially when I think I found the right sort of product market fit.
Advice to young people out there looking to get into media or perhaps starting a podcast? What would you tell them?
I would start a podcast with a clear value proposition. I think, everybody might see the success of Call Her Daddy, which has been amazing, and say, well, what if I just kind of started chatting with my friends and starting something up? I see a lot of that and just hoping kind of it goes viral. I think that's a harder approach. I think niche is a good way to start. As I said, like I didn't start out with a business podcast. I said it's going to be an investing podcast. That's an easier value proposition to kind of package. It's an easier one to communicate to people. It's an easier one to get advertisers. And so if you can have a very clear value proposition, when you come to my podcast, and it should just be 1 or 2 sentences, when you get to my podcast, this is what you're going to get. And then if that's your foundation, it just helps with everything. It's almost like a mission statement, right? It just helps like align. Okay, so the logo, everything just needs to look like this or take us to that sort of destination. And if you're really serious about it, I could not have done this by myself. I know you do this on your own, and I'm so impressed. I couldn't have even made this mic work on my own. So I don't let what I don't know get in the way of actually doing it, but I lean on people, and I could not do this by myself. I have an amazing team who took a risk in joining me, and I'm so grateful that they did. But I don't pretend to like know all the answers or have all the things. You just got to like source it. Figure out what you know, what you're good at, stick with that. Figure out what you need and what you need help with, and get that involved too.
I think that's a great conversation. I won't go on any longer. I really appreciate your time today. For the listener, people can find your podcast on Apple and all the other platforms. In the Money with Amber Kanwar, I think, and your website?
Yes, and inthemoneypod.com. But yeah, really, we're everywhere. YouTube, Spotify, Apple. You can find us anywhere.
I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. You can also subscribe to the podcast where your token of support is much appreciated. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.